The structure of world peace cannot be the work of one man or one party or one nation. It must be a peace which rests on the cooperative effort of the whole world. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1945. 27 years earlier, American President Woodrow Wilson began his efforts to create an international coalition for peace, forming an organization that would become his most recognizable success as well as his most devastating failure. It would be called the League of Nations, a revolutionary step in the history of international politics, an innovative shift in diplomatic philosophy, paving the way for world peace. With the absence of major powers like the United States and the resurgence of nationalism in the 1930s, however, the League was doomed to be engulfed in the flames of World War II to have its successor, the United Nations, rise from the ashes. In 1915, the imperial powers of Europe fought in the most devastating war the world had ever known. Because of the recent industrial boom, improved weapons and numbers drastically increased the destructive capacity of the major military powers. It was a war to end all wars.
When war broke out in 1914, Wilson thought that the war was a result of this flawed international system. These competing alliances, the rise of militarism across Europe, an arms race. The existing system didn't have a supervisory authority. It was anarchy. It was the law of the jungle.
The system was so unstable because international standards were ineffective. Beginning in the 17th century, international laws were developed, largely the work of Dutch scholar Hugo Grotius. He created the legal science to regulate warfare and suggested the formation of collective security organizations. This fueled an entirely new age of diplomacy, and international legal institutions began to form. Many of these, however, did nothing to stop war. If anything, they made the objectionable conditions of war more bearable. While warfare raged in Europe, President Wilson remained steadfast in his advocacy of American neutrality in order to act as an effective mediator at the war's end.
We know from subsequent history there was this notion of isolationism, right? And unusual for a country that was such a powerhouse to talk about being isolated.
Wilson soon discovered the futility of neutrality. In May of 1915, the civilian luxury liner Lusitania was nearing its arrival in England when it was sunk by a German submarine. To the dismay of Republicans like Theodore Roosevelt, who threatened to skin him alive if he didn't go to war, Wilson was unresponsive. 2 years later, however, when Germany declared all-out submarine warfare against American naval activity in the Atlantic, Wilson had no choice but to commit himself to war. Wilson's war policy was a unique one. He sought not revenge nor utter annihilation of the enemy. Instead, he aimed to achieve what he called a peace without victors, one which would create a lasting termination of hostilities between all nations. Always the idealist, Wilson entered the war preparing to develop a peace when it was over. Wilson appointed an inquiry of experts to travel to Europe and identify the causes of war in the hopes of making an educated plan for peace. Wilson knew he had to be fair to all parties, and that restraining German economic and military development too much could lead to future wars. The information provided by the inquiry served as the basis for his famous 14-point speech, where he provided a plan for a peaceful world of self-governed nations. There would be no more secret treaties, no more restrictions on maritime navigation, no more arms races endangering millions. The last and perhaps most contentious of Wilson's points was the formation of a General Association of Nations. Wilson's plan was adopted by the Allied statesmen as war objectives, and when the Germans requested an armistice in October of 1918, it too was on the basis of the 14 points. 2 months later, when Wilson traveled to Europe to push forward his League of Nations, he was greeted with enormous enthusiasm. Thousands poured into the streets to applaud him, and many even hailed him as a savior. At the Paris Peace Conference, Wilson was appointed the chairman of the commission designated to draft the League's covenant. France and Britain objected to many of his efforts, saying that since they had suffered the brunt of the casualties, Germany should pay them exorbitant reparations. Wilson found himself pitted against two diplomatic sharks, George Clemenceau of France and David Lloyd George of Britain, whose national interests forced Wilson to compromise on his 14 points to the point where Germany felt entirely betrayed, having been promised the points as the foundation for the treaty. Wilson returned home in 1919 to a very tense legislative debate. Wilson's decision not to bring any Republican senators to Paris put him at odds with the very people he had to convince to ratify the treaty.
At one point, the Democratic leadership in the Senate said to the president, "We can get the League through. We can get the treaty through if we will only compromise with your big foe, Henry Cabot Lodge, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee." And Wilson was angry and his voice shook and he said, "Let Lodge compromise." He was not going to bend.
When Lodge compiled a list of reservations objecting to elements of the League's covenant that might infringe on American sovereignty, Wilson left on a 10,000-mile speaking tour urging the necessity of the League. The senators remained steadfast in their opposition, saying that the League would destroy the Monroe Doctrine and take away control of immigration. On March 19, 1920, the Senate made its decision to reject the Treaty of Versailles, and Wilson's efforts to create a lasting peace along with it. The Senate rejection of the treaty handicapped the League of Nations, but it was still able to operate without its primary sponsor. The first international court was formed. Over 2,000 treaties were signed. Numerous conflicts were settled using arbitration. In 1920, an international health office was formed to fight typhus in Poland, not to mention the other bodies formed to advance communications and world markets. The policy of disarmament was introduced, where members were obligated to reduce their national stores of weapons. The boldest of the League's peace efforts occurred in 1928, when 31 nations renounced war entirely by signing the multilateral treaty known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact. In the 1930s, the philosophy behind the League began to fade, and the conflicts it sought to resolve became more complicated. Attempts at disarmament failed because nations were not willing to risk being attacked without ample defenses. When the Great Depression devastated the world economies in 1929, the once faded blight of nationalism returned with a vengeance to further hamper the League's peace efforts. Japan found itself shut out of American markets and invaded Manchuria to compensate for their lost economic resources. Economic sanctions could not be agreed upon. A council resolution for Japanese withdrawal from China, requiring a unanimous vote, was unceremoniously vetoed by the Japanese delegate. When the League's assembly finally resolved to reprimand Japan's formation of a puppet state, Japan avoided a solution by withdrawing from the League. Months later, Hitler announced that Germany would do the same because it was being held to unequal disarmament standards. They immediately began increasing military expenditures and withdrew from the League of Nations, which was becoming weaker by the day. Although at the start of the Second World War the League was virtually ineffective, it wouldn't be declared dissolved until 1946, when it was replaced by its successor, the United Nations.
The League of Nations influenced the future of international organizations because it really was the first major formal international body. The ideas of being able to structure around, maybe not on security, although the United Nations, of course, is the security organization, but on a host of social and cultural issues and economic issues, and World Health Organizations and food and agriculture organization. Direct outgrowth of successes that the League of Nations had and experiences that nations and people working in international bureaucrats working in these organizations that had working in the League now carry over into the post-World War II era.
Today, international organizations play a huge role in fighting hunger, helping refugees, stopping regional conflicts, and securing rights of people all over the world. The League of Nations is often referred to as an organization ill-equipped to deal with the challenges it faced. In the 1930s, with economic strife, militant nationalism, splintering cooperation, and increasingly difficult conflicts, the League could do nothing to prevent a Second World War. Although it failed, Woodrow Wilson's legacy lives on to this day. The change in ideology that made the League of Nations possible was an innovation that altered international politics forever. The last assembly was famously closed with the words, "The League is dead. Long live the United Nations.